Welcome to FedTax 101. In this episode, we're going to discuss the IRS, the structure of the organization, the key players at the IRS, and each one's role within the tax system. At the end of the episode, we'll discuss some practice pointers for putting this information to good use in your practice. The first thing we're going to do is dispense with the notion that the IRS is the evil empire, or worse. It isn't. It's just a group of people trying to do their jobs the best they can. Needless to say, when your job is to separate people from their money, you're never going to be the most popular person in town. But if the government is going to keep the lights on, someone has to do it. The IRS is one of the many agencies within the Treasury Department, so that ultimately the IRS reports to the Secretary of the Treasury. Although its size varies over time, depending upon how generous Congress is feeling with the budget, the IRS currently employs roughly 75,000 people. Of those, 2 are presidential appointees requiring Senate confirmation: the Commissioner of Internal Revenue and the IRS Chief Counsel. The Commissioner has authority over the entire IRS, but the Chief Counsel reports to the Commissioner only for certain purposes. For other purposes, the Chief Counsel reports to the General Counsel of the Treasury Department. This makes the Office of Chief Counsel sort of a hybrid. Technically, it's part of the overall IRS, but in many ways, it acts like a separate law firm with the IRS as its only client, one whose client can't fire it. You may hear counsel attorneys refer to the IRS side or the commissioner side as distinct from themselves being counsel. Sometimes that mindset really comes into play in how the 2 parts of the agency interact with one another. Let's start by dividing the overall IRS along these lines: the IRS side and counsel, and look at them separately. Let's start with the IRS side. Like the overall agency, the commissioner side also can be divided neatly into 2 parts: operations, responsible for basically running the agency itself, things like HR, internal accounting, the IT department, purchasing, things like that; and services and enforcement, the part of the IRS that deals directly with taxpayers and their representatives. We don't really care how the IRS runs its own business, so let's focus on services and enforcement. You see on this organization chart that there are quite a few offices with various responsibilities. But to simplify things for our purposes, think of the IRS as being composed of returns processing, compliance, and collections. The IRS is responsible for many more things than that, and so has dozens of separate offices with various responsibilities. But the main thing the IRS is supposed to do is collect cash for the government to spend on other things. So, for purposes of our introduction, let's just focus on the central parts of the IRS that collect the cash. When you file a return, the first stop is the returns processing function, which includes the service centers scattered around the country. The service center receives the return, either through the mail or electronically, checks to make sure you've satisfied the various procedural filing requirements, and then sends the return further downstream in the processing system. The return eventually finds its way to your IRS file, which is updated to reflect this year's return information: the amount of taxes due, the amount you paid, whether the return was filed on time, and things like that. If your return is selected for examination, the next step of its journey would be compliance, or more commonly called exam. Once upon a time, exam was a single, very large organization responsible for auditing tax returns, and that's all it did. Since about 2000, though, many of the IRS's core activities, including exam, have been organized into 4 separate stovepipe operating divisions. Each operating division is designed to handle nearly all matters involving a specific category of taxpayers. So exam is now scattered across each of these 4 operating divisions. At the risk of grossly oversimplifying things, wage and investment is responsible for most individual returns. Tax exempt and government entities deals with tax exempt organizations like churches and schools, and with government entities like state and local governments and Native American tribes. For most tax practitioners, though, the operating divisions you're most likely to come into contact with are small business and self employed, generally for smaller businesses with assets of less than $10 million, and large business and international for larger corporations and partnerships having assets of more than $10 million. The actual jurisdictional lines are more precise than that, but for today's purposes, just be aware that LB&I focuses on large companies and SBSE is responsible for smaller ones. The Independent Office of Appeals is another important part of the compliance side of the IRS. Appeals is unrelated to any of the operating divisions, so it's completely separate from exam. Appeals is designed to give your case a fresh look if you and exam ultimately cannot resolve your differences and exam concludes you owe additional taxes. Unlike exam, appeals can consider not only the technical merits of the parties' positions, but also the litigating hazards if the IRS were to take the issue to court. For that reason, unlike exam, appeals can offer you a settlement without regard to who is right and who is wrong. If you ultimately can't work things out with appeals either, your next step is court. That means either tax court, a federal district court, or the Court of Federal Claims. But that's a discussion for another day. Once you exhaust all of your options and are found to owe additional taxes, most taxpayers just pay the additional amount due and the matter is closed. Some taxpayers aren't as cooperative, though, and have to deal with the collections function of IRS, the bill collectors. Once upon a time, that also was a separate division, but now it's also embedded within the operating divisions. If your conduct is so egregious as to be tax evasion or tax fraud, a completely separate part of the IRS, the Criminal Investigations Division, may show up at your door with gold badges, guns, and probably the FBI. Now let's look at Chief Counsel. Like the IRS side, counsel breaks down pretty neatly into two halves, which we'll call the national office and the field. In the broadest terms, the national office is responsible for policy level projects that are not taxpayer specific, things like regulations and revenue rulings, and for taxpayer specific matters that are raised before the taxpayer files a return taking a particular position. For example, if you want a private letter ruling on whether a particular transaction is tax-free, you have to submit that request to the national office before you file the return for the tax year in which you completed the deal. If you don't, then as soon as the tax return is filed, jurisdiction over that matter shifts from the national office to the compliance functions we just discussed. So very roughly, think of the filing of the tax return as the boundary between the national office and the field. The national office consists of attorneys working in a single location, the IRS headquarters building in Washington, D.C. The national office is organized based on subject matter, with each division headed by an associate chief counsel. Each associate chief counsel is responsible for pretty much everything within specific parts of the tax code. So, for example, there's an Office of Associate Chief Counsel, Income Tax and Accounting, an Associate Chief Counsel for Corporate, one for pass-throughs and special industries, one for international, one for financial institutions and products, and various others. Each Associate Chief Counsel office is divided into separate branches, again, generally based upon specific subject matter areas. The branches will include a branch chief, a senior technician reviewer, and on average, 10 attorneys or so. The other major component of chief counsel plays a completely different role. These chief counsel attorneys, normally referred to as the field, are the primary legal advisors for the operating divisions. Recall that I said the IRS side is divided into separate operating divisions based on groupings of taxpayers. Well, the chief counsel field structure mirrors that of exam. Instead of being headed by an associate chief counsel, though, each major segment of this part is headed by a division counsel. A relatively small number of attorneys work directly for the division counsel in a headquarters capacity. Most of the other field attorneys are based in offices around the country, close to the exam teams. These attorneys directly assist exam teams in auditing taxpayer returns, advocating exam's position in discussions with the national office about pending regulations and revenue rulings that exam may be concerned about, serving as the government's trial lawyers in cases before the U.S. tax court, and various other things. So, zooming back out and looking at the IRS as a whole, are all IRS employees the same? Of course not. And these differences can sometimes lead to strained internal dynamics within the overall IRS. Exam can become frustrated with the neutrality of appeals. For example, an exam team and the field attorneys may not appreciate appeals settling on terms favorable to the taxpayer, but exam sees as a slam dunk case that they spent a lot of time on. Exam and the field attorneys also don't always see eye to eye with the national office. In general, some in the field see the national office as being too taxpayer friendly and not sufficiently supportive of exam. For example, the field may get upset if the exam team has requested a technical advice memorandum or chief counsel advice as part of an audit, and the national office sides with the taxpayer. They also may get upset by regulations or revenue rulings that they see as unduly favorable to taxpayers or that require them to concede a contentious issue that they've invested a lot of resources developing. The field's perception of the national office sometimes results in exam teams not asking the national office for help on complex legal issues that they may not fully understand, much to the frustration of the taxpayer being audited. On the flip side, national office attorneys may think exam and the field attorneys are more focused on winning than on getting the right answer. They may see the generalists in the field as not giving sufficient deference to the national office's experts in interpreting complex tax rules, or of being results driven in how they interpret the tax law. So, why does this matter? Well, just as successful coaches always scout the other team to get to know their players and how they play the game, the most successful tax attorneys understand the IRS in the same way. Strategically, the key thing to remember is that the IRS is not a monolith, and the individuals working there are not all the same. Different parts of the IRS have distinct roles, distinct perspectives, and different tools at their disposal in working with taxpayers. The result you get for your client may depend upon who you ask, how, and when. If your client's issue is sufficiently important, you might want to be proactive and approach the national office before filing a return. You might be able to get their thoughts informally through a telephone call or a meeting at the national office, by formally requesting a private letter ruling, or by working through a trade association to approach the chief counsel and treasury about resolving the issue more broadly through a regulation or revenue ruling. Skipping the national office and waiting to discuss the issue with exam might reduce your chances of a successful outcome and could turn out to be just as expensive and time consuming as taking care of the issue before filing the return, especially if you end up having to go to appeals or to court. But on the upside, you might get lucky. An exam either doesn't examine that year's return at all, Or if they do, they don't raise this issue. Understanding the IRS and the key players is critical in helping your client make an informed strategic decision. Finally, understanding the IRS helps you better interpret documents that get published in the tax press. Always check to see what type of document it is and who wrote it. Was it written by someone in the national office or someone in the field? Is it over the signature of an associate chief counsel or that of a branch chief? Was it a memo written by a field attorney to an exam team? Is it nothing more than an email between chief counsel attorneys that the tax press received in a huge batch of documents under the Freedom of Information Act? These sorts of nuances can make a big difference in understanding what you're looking at and how to factor it into your analysis, but you can only do that by knowing the players. Well, that's it for this episode of FedTax 101. Keep checking back for more.